is that home? Where is that home? Where is that home? Where is that home?
Dearest humans, good evening and welcome to Quarantine Storytime, a weekly reading series streaming live from our living room in Saco, Maine. I'm your host, Douglas Whisper Milliken, and with me as always is my partner, Genevieve Johnson, reminding me to slow down my delivery. Special shout out to Luke Shorty for being our first fiscal sponsor, not to mention one hell of a dancer. Thank you for watching my make-believe TV show. So last week we started, or at least attempted to start, with some new music by Dean Thornton, an old friend of mine who has the fantastic knack of writing guitar patterns I cannot even begin to comprehend. However, we had some bullshit go down with the audio, so you probably didn't get to hear any of Dean's songs last week. So I figured, in the name of fairness, we'd give Deaner a second chance on the Quarantine Storytime's pre-show music time. Dean's new record is called We're Glad You're Here, and you can learn more about the album, stream it in its entirety, and maybe even purchase a copy via one of the links immediately below the screen. And if you'd like to hear your music on a future episode of Pre-Show Music Time, feel free to reach out to me in the live chat or the contact link below, and we'll work out a thing. And yes, I said future episode, meaning today's show will not, in fact, be the last. Between everyone's shelter-in-place orders being extended through the end of April, the consistent positive reinforcement I've received over the past month, and also the simple fact that I enjoy doing this, I've decided to produce and perform another quartet of Quarantine Storytimes. Upon Genevieve's insistence, April will be, for lack of a better phrase, Horse Month. As some of you might know, the image of the horse appears and reappears with a strange regularity within my stories, often unbidden. There have, in fact, been times when I've finished a story and thought, hey, no horses. Good job, buddy. Only to later discover, to my surprise, a goddamn horse hidden in the background. Perhaps someday, I lost my place. No, perhaps someday I will figure out the why and what for of this weird equine obsession. In the meantime, Horse Month. Because I tend to languish in the absence of structures, let's just go ahead and say the episodes will be ghost horses, mythic horses, and no actual horses. And because assembling this week's kinda amorphous request episode was oddly thrilling, we'll end with another one of these viewers' choice shows. So feel free to start right now telling me what to do and how I should do it, as this is likely the only venue wherein I'll potentially do as you say. So let us begin. One of the requests we received at the end of last week's show was from Noah Morgan, perhaps the proudest Ohioan among a teeming throng of proud Ohioans, who said that Genevieve and I should read from our childhood journals, which G and I both agree would make for an entertaining humiliation. However, neither of us kept journals as kids, and while I do have over a decade's worth of notebooks crammed full of spidery handwritten drafts, I don't think those really count as diaries. Genevieve, however, began keeping a journal shortly after we moved into our house here in Saco. So to open up tonight's show, Genevieve is going to join us in reading some choice morsels she's composed about our silly co-domesticity. Ready to join us, baby? Should I exit the screen, or will I be your
Oh yeah, get out of here.
Okay, this is Genevieve's show for a moment.
None of you can see this, but Halumi just crawled behind the books on the bottom shelf, so she's joining us as well. So, as Douglas mentioned, about a year and a bit ago, at the beginning of 2019, I started keeping this book. As one who sometimes needs extreme structure, I decided I wanted a moleskin, the weekly 7-day variety, where there is about a 2-inch block that can be filled in, because it left me just snippets. It wasn't too much of a commitment. So I'm going to read a few of these because they capture a little bit of the silliness and joy that Douglas and I have in our lives. Monday, January 28th. Douglas said he didn't want chips for dinner. I offered to make nachos. Wednesday, April 17th. If you see a snake and a salamander in the same day, it's pretty much like seeing a lizard. That was a quote from Douglas on that day. Monday, May 6th. The first tulip opened, a yellow bloom. Douglas thought the top blossom on the magnolia would be the first to open. I thought the front. We were both right. June 8th. Sitting on the toilet with period cramp poops, I noticed the first summer night cricket sounds. Thursday, July 4th. Together we knelt in the lawn, grazing silently for wild strawberries. Well, nearly silently. The occasional pff of your eager breath blowing off threads of grass before popping the blushed fruit into your expectant mouth, or the pff of juicy tongue and lips expelling a green crown, now a projectile, through the deepening afternoon light. July 13th, a Saturday. Douglas took a clear sticker with the number 3 off my right ass cheek this morning. Tuesday, July 23rd. The first of 3 daylilies bloomed yesterday, but 2 of them were destroyed in the rain. Monday, August 12th. Artie came to visit from Colorado and spent the night. We ate a meat pile at the Lost Fire and shared stories. Artie had overheard, "Slow the fuck down, you seal fuck," from a mom yelling at her 4-year-old biking down Congress Street. 1 snapdragon is in bloom. Tuesday, August 20th. Came down to breakfast to find the German Chancellor Angela Merkel finishing a breakfast meeting. Monday, October 7th. A bald eagle swooped down to grab something in the road at the Uinta exit on the drive home. Crisp and clean against the misty highway. Saturday, November 23rd. Derek tenderly tucked pistachio shells into Douglas's pockets during the 3rd reading of the Our Shadows Voice party. December 12th. It's a Thursday. I asked Douglas if he wanted to lick the inside of a green duck to see if there was any residual acid left. He told me never again to ask him to lick the inside of a duck. From the sweet and tender to the absurd, a year in our lives.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Genevieve. It's really nice that we had a guest on the show. It's the first guest we've had on the show, and it's the person that's on the show every week, but it's different because you did a thing that's different. That's a guest. Okay, so last week's show proved to be a lot of fun for me, much more than I had anticipated, especially when we got to the Q&A portion at the end. While I certainly feel more confident and properly equipped when performing with even a loose script, I also get a distinct pleasure from having to improvise answers and responses in real time, perhaps because the risk of failure runs so high, which in itself is something worth considering. the exhilaration of potential failure. It's a notion that over the past week began to dovetail with something that came up during the Q&A and also in a few follow-up emails and messages I received from some of you. That being the role of joy in my stories and where that joy exists. As I recall, I struggled with coming up with a coherent response for that question. What role does joy play in my creative practice? And while I did talk for a while about the intentional incorporation of humor in my stories, that really isn't the same thing. So what is the role of joy in my work? I thought about this all damn week. And what I came up with is complicated, but one thing I can say with certainty is this. Despite the dead albinos and fears of oppression and friends buried in misnamed graves, there is, in fact, joy throughout my stories, all of my stories, whether it's loud or subdued, hilarious or discreet. But it's always joy within a context. Take, for example, the passages from Our Shadow's Voice that I read during our very first episode. Sometimes that narrator's joy is expressed in the simple beauty of her tortoiseshell cat's insanely patterned, or I guess anti-patterned fur, or the tumbling flight of a down feather. And sometimes it's expressed through the specific memories of her family, be they present or long gone. But all of this is relayed within the context of her son's death. Each instance of joy, in fact, written as a letter to her dead son. It's the context of grief and loss that gives her joy meaning. She's probably not conscious of that, nor do I suspect you or I or anyone else is consciously thinking of our lifetimes of trauma when we're dancing real close and slow with our favorite someone or taking the first bite of a profoundly delicious meal. But it's what gives her joy richness. The fact that it's fleeting. The fact that it's rare. Which is another way of saying it's precious. And I think this is where that dovetailing I mentioned earlier occurs for me. The precious untrappability of joy, the thrill of failure risked. Because being able to do a reading like this, having the opportunity to share my work with an attentive audience, is a very real joy for me. Being able to write stories at all, to sit down again and again and create a new story out of nothing more than the essentially random electric firings of my synapses, each time is an overwhelming joy for me. And both experiences are so ripe with the potential of failure. I mean, I could blow this moment right now in so many ways, perhaps most easily and succinctly by just being boring. But if you're hearing me say this, that means you're still watching, still listening, which means I haven't failed yet. And that brings me great joy. All right, enough about me and the weird stuff that makes me feel good. It's story time. In tonight's exploration of narrative joy, I'm going to read two pieces. The first is a very short story that was just published by Reflex Fiction, a piece called Saline that time has proven to be the first in a series of stories about its two principal characters, Nala and Jaylee, whose shared life is full of great sorrow and great joy. Described by one reader as jazz on the page, this is Saline. The wife is talking so, and I'm laughing. I'm on my side on our ever mistreated couch. My wife is talking, and I'm laughing to beat Jesus. It's a too small t-shirt that might actually be hers. So small, almost all my soft belly lies exposed. And brand new underwear because even fuck up sometimes deserve nice things. And I'm laughing full and loud and without hope of control while my wife tells me her story. She's in the three-legged wingback in the corner across from me, legs crossed but arms out like even she can't believe what she's saying. And I have no idea what she's talking about. Black hair like a mythic waterfall, tight-knit dress like something our hot young grandmas would have worn. What's she talking about? What's she telling me? The cat lolls on the rug in its 7 a.m. boredom, and my wife is telling a story that might be a memory, or might be a dream, or might maybe just be something she one time heard. Who can say? And I'm laughing like lives depend on it. Countless tiny lives. Or anyway, 3 lives. These 3 lives. My wife and my cat I'm laughing to keep us alive. My inner arm burns still and itches while my bones continue their quaking. That's what it feels like steady tremors thrumming my marrow. And I know I won't eat for another day yet, but that's okay. I'm set. The wife's voice, the cat attacking its tail, my laughter, drawn from a well deeper than whatever, scraped of everything that isn't pure. I'm set. She raises her arms to look at her hands. First one, then the other, then the first, then the other, as if she's never seen them before. Pillow wet with tears. Being clean's never felt so... Again, that was Saline, recently published in the journal Reflex Fiction. The next piece is something a bit older, a story I wrote while in residence at the iPark Foundation in East Haddam, Connecticut, and that was actually included in the original manuscript for Blue of the World, but at the last minute was cut due to it being too much of a tonal and thematic outlier. So, without further introduction, here is Arena. The old man sleeps through the night, and in the morning remains in bed. The bunk above him is empty, as are those on the other side of his cell. No pictures on the walls. From one high window, white light pours between the bars as a milky steam, while down the block, other men stir awake. But they are quiet in their waking. The old man lifts his lined and tired face from the pillow just once, sees that everything is exactly as it's been, turns back toward the wall, and sleeps. The boy considers himself lucky. Until now, he's never had to serve. Not too bad a streak. He'd taken the ferry over because he'd heard there were old military bunkers on the island's far side, tunnels and unlit chambers where he could squat and read books and occasionally wander into the hamlets for food. But the local constabulary picked him up almost immediately on charges of vagrancy, which he had a hard time denying was precisely his arena of guilt. For being such a small population, the island's jail is huge. It will only later occur to the boy that this is part of the facility he was seeking. The prison van rolls past the gates, and he's led through the halls inside, where he is struck by the interior silence. Barely a sound above the echoing footfalls landing on damp concrete. He's deloused and given fresh clothes, blankets, and a bedroll, then is escorted to a cell with 2 empty bunk beds and a latrine in between, and it's only after he's heaved his roll onto the vacant bunk that he notices the old man, curled beneath a blanket and, with a startled "oh," now no longer asleep. High above the concrete box of the prison, seagulls turn lazily in the sky, wings outstretched and gliding. Only their gun turret heads are at work, looking here and then looking here, seeking any scrap to eat for which they will not have to work. The light of the sun paints the whole sky white, and in some places, the water shines pure and white as well, as if ocean and sky have become the same thing. An island afloat in flawless white. These are things the boy saw before being led into prison. They're things the old man has forgotten. The boy winces an apology when he sees the old man startled and blinking from within his woolen nest of blanket. Both men are dressed in gray pants and gray button-up shirts. The old man's clothes are more threadbare than the boy's. The boy unrolls his bedroll on the opposing top bunk, strips down to his white undershirt, and clambers up into his berth, springs rustily singing beneath his weight. In motions synchronized and blindly incidental, the boy leans back and folds his arms behind his head while the old man sits up to press his bare feet into the floor. One last quiet moment of aloneness passes in their cell. The boy fixes his eyes on the ceiling and sees neither concrete nor stone, but a remembered girl, waded knee-deep from the shore and bent in half to splash salt water in her hair. The old man breathes deeply and rubs his eyes, itchy with sleep, and scrapes his bare feet against the concrete floor for warmth. Outside, the sound of flocking seabirds ebbs and fades through the window. Then the boy speaks, and their individual solitude becomes shared. So how'd you land here? The question is not an idle politeness. He really wants to know. But the old man only holds an extended finger to his lips and hisses. Shh. And the boy looks down at him, surprised. He winks. Throughout the prison, only a couple dozen men are contained. Most of the cells are empty. Those that are occupied often hold 2 men. It's considered good policy not to keep anyone too alone. It is healthy, the warden believes, to have another man to whisper to. Whenever possible, an even number of prisoners is maintained. Among the population, not one man feels he's been wrongly accused. Each is certain this is where he belongs. In whispers, the old man and the boy exchange names. But these are not the names they knew and used when last these 2 men met. Nearly 20 years have passed since either has seen the other, and they are changed, especially the boy. When he tells the old man his age, the old man just hums and nods. He does not speak his thoughts. Instead, after a moment's internal disambiguation, he says, "When I was your age, my pop caught me in the barn with my cousin Ethelene, dragged me through the yard by my ear while I hollered and flopped like a fish. And then he tossed me in the compost. Seems to me you'd have been old enough to decide for yourself whether or not to plow that field. Seemed that way to me too. Yet all evidence suggests I was wrong on that account." "Your pop," the boy says, "sounds like a prick." But the old man says, "I liked him." And both are surprised by this revelation. He really hadn't known he meant it until it was said. The old man smiles at his memory. "He taught me lots of stuff." The boy had enjoyed being on his own. He liked traveling around. There were people everywhere, and most were interesting, and those who weren't could be walked away from. His patience and high tolerance for bad luck would have, in another life, made him a fine teacher. But he liked the life he'd chosen. He could always find work when he needed it because he was strong and learned quickly and didn't care how hard or dirty a job could become. His employers, mostly farmers or men who ran warehouses, were always sad to see him go. But isn't leaving what you know just as exciting as finding something new? He'd wander to the next town or the town after that and roost for a while in an empty barn or farmhouse forgotten by time. These places are invisible, he learned, and they are everywhere. He could buy food or steal food, and it all felt the same. The money he had mostly went to books. Those, he believed, were a crime to steal, though he felt no qualms about leaving them behind. "I came out here on some bum advice," he explains. He's moved his bedroll to the lower bunk so they can keep talking in lower tones. In this way, the conscious silence, the jail is like a library. As if it were a fine, hard candy, the boy savors the whisper of their words. "I've been told by this guy that I could live easy out here in the old army barracks, but the cops picked me up almost as soon as I got off the boat." The old man smiles, but says nothing. The boy will figure it out. In his hand, the old man holds a yo-yo. Now and then, he'll do a little trick. "How about you?" the boy asks. "How long you been here?" "It's the way branches move with the wind. how the old man's shoulders shrug. Long enough to grow a beard, I guess. He'd lived on the island for a while, having moved here after things stopped working with his wife back on land. He'd married late in a poorly timed moment of forgetfulness, his memory of willful solitude and drifting returning only after he'd sworn himself to the company of a quick and iron-eyed girl. It was a sad, ugly time between that remembering and when he finally gave up on land. He preferred to think the land gave up on him. He crossed the water and for a time held a job replacing shingles on the roofs of people's homes. It was a task that appeared simple to those who'd never tried it. It took a certain finesse to do it right. Repairing a leak correctly without drawing attention to the repair. He enjoyed accruing that finesse. He became a master at a thing he cared nothing about. As a result, he did not have many repeat customers, and that was okay. A validation in its own manner. But one day, he didn't feel like doing that anymore. What he wanted to do instead was drink brandy. It was a means to lie on a rock by the beach for days without feeling too guilty. He'd close his eyes with the bottle pressed to his lips and think, this is the life. Then he'd fall asleep in the sun. Now and then, he wishes he could have made it last. But something must have happened because shortly after making this choice to drink instead of work, he found himself being led to a cell. He remembers it felt right when they locked the door. He was grateful, but he doesn't tell any of this to the boy. The boy watches the old man make a sort of pendulum with the yo-yo. He watches its clutch skitter like an animal, tugging against its leash across the floor. Then he asks, so how long's your sentence? The old man snaps the clutch back up into his hand. How long is yours? But to this, the boy says nothing. It hadn't occurred to him to ask when they brought him in. Through the window comes the sound of many seagulls crying all at once. Someone's found something that everyone wants. The two men listen to the raucous storm of bird call build and reside. Then only white light pours in through the window. I imagine, the old man finally says, we can leave when it seems we're ready. He dips his yo-yo down. He dips the clutch back up. There's an exercise yard at the center of the prison, but the old man does not like to go out there. It's better to stay inside. He's not sure how he came to this conclusion. All his life, he has loved to work or laze outdoors, in the woods or by the water, but it's unquestionable how right it feels now to stay in. As if maybe it's a correction, something he always got wrong, running from the oppression of houses. I got a ma somewhere, the boy says, when the old man asks after his family. I don't know where she is. I doubt she'd have stayed put waiting for me to come home. Or if she did, she'd have gotten tired of waiting and moved on years ago. She'd stick around somewhere for a good thing, but if something wasn't good, she'd go. I can't imagine waiting for me was anything she'd consider good. While the boy speaks, the old man bungles a trick. Now his yo-yo's a mess. No, the old man says, I doubt she would. He likes the way this woman sounds, the sort of resolute personality with whom he could easily spend some time. How about you? The boy asks. You got anyone out there? The old man thinks for a moment with the yo-yo string tangled in his hands. It's like the knots contain an answer, the way he studies their cinches and loops. But when he speaks, all he says is, I had a boy. In a while, the cells are opened to the faint scent of food threading through the air. It is lunchtime in the cafeteria. Slowly, the inmates shuffle into the corridor. They concur without words. It'll be good to eat and see their friends eating. This is the guiding impulse when the boy and old man stand to go, and in the narrows of their cell, Their bodies are all but touching. They are nearly the same height, but of course the boy, being younger, is less bent, less worn down by time, and so looks taller. Standing so closely, they look at each other and smile, their bodies in proximity expressing some sort of agreement. Just as easily as we lose each other, we find one another too. How much does it matter if we know who it is we found? The old man and the boy walk out together to seek their lunch in the cafeteria. Neither notices that the other is also duck-footed, while outside in the white, where sea and sky fade mercifully one into the other, the seagulls all holler and spiral and fall. Again, that was Arena, a last-minute omission from my collection, Blue of the World. Now, Genevieve is going to join me at the desk and kind of moderate your questions from the live chat. Slide on in here. Hi.
Hi, I'm back.
You're back. Thank you for joining me more.
All right. Start us off with a question from the comment box. The unknown and the quintessential new.
Mm-hmm.
Are they one and the same?
I guess definitively they're not, but experientially, like, how would you know the difference?
In the moment.
In the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
In reflection,
Yeah, you
would be able
in time you might be able to deduce one from the other, but in the moment of experience it's the same. Right?
I think that's fair.
Who asked that?
That was from Luke.
It's a good one. I like it. Okay.
The sense of movement
Mm-hmm.
in this story, the attention to shoulders moving like trees, the yo-yo was, I think, enhanced by my attention in quarantine to a limited space.
Mm.
Can you talk about how you thought of the physical environment of the cell and how intentional the inclusion and attention to movement was in your writing process?
I knew a lot of what they were expressing, whether the other person picked up on it or not, was physical. Like, there's very little dialogue. They're mostly just there together. I wrote the story 8 years ago, so it's not super fresh in my memory what all of my guiding impulses were. But the space where I wrote it at the iPark Foundation, it's a really amazing residency in a very spooky part of Connecticut. And there were 8 of us sharing a house. We each had our own rooms, but we had a communal kitchen, and we each had our own studios. So there was, I think all of us were very conscious of space, how we were using this shared space and how we used our private spaces. So that might have had something to do with it. Just that heightened awareness of physical bodies that didn't know each other being put together.
That's a fun tidbit of insight.
Yeah, but it may have had nothing to do with it. I don't know. I don't remember. But knowing how much of my writing process is like going on impulse and not thinking too much about why I'm making the choices I'm making in that moment of composition, I think that could very well have been informing my composition of that story.
Okay, pulling back a lot, can you talk about your process for naming stories?
It's hard. Naming a story is really hard. you want the title to represent something essential of the story without, as my Aunt Mary would say, like sucking the wind out of the sails. I remember like when I was in college, there was one story that it was an essay actually that eventually was titled Topography, and the original version was called Discovering Inhabited Lands, which I think is a fine title, but it's actually a line in like the first paragraph of the story. So like it sabotaged itself. So sometimes like finding if there's a line in a story that's really good, like that will volunteer itself as the title. Like Blue of the World is a good example of that. I'm not sure if the word arena appeared in the original draft or if I named it Arena and then found an opportunity to actually include the word in the story. It may have been that line about the boy acknowledging his arena of guilt might have been, that line may have really stood out to me, and that's why I chose Arena for the title. But sometimes it's like I'm almost like a joke, like I'm undercutting what I'm doing or making some sort of playful comparison between parts. Like I have a story that's called Mule and Tourist, which is a very dark, like desperate sort of story. At least like the actual experiences. The narrator doesn't really see it that way, but the setting itself in the scenario is pretty bleak. A title like Mule and Tourist, I don't know what that sets up for a person, but those names come from like there's one character who's known as the Mule, and there's another character who views he's a very like hyper aggressive, like hypersexual person, and he refers to his time in prison as I think it's sexual tourism, something along those lines. So the story is about those two characters, this brutal hypersexual dude and the Mule, which isn't anything you would get from the title, but it is a accurate reflection of what the story is about, I think.
And similarly, your naming of characters, both human and non-human.
Yeah, I like finding names for people. I made a decision a long time ago that, and this is true, I think, in fiction and also in reality, that domestic animals, especially cats and dogs, especially cats, should be named after food. So pretty much everything I've written since White Horses, if there's an animal, it's probably named after food, be it gravy or Crispix or onion. Captain Crunch is a dog.
Clearly.
Are there other good ones I'm forgetting?
Crispix is my favorite.
Cashew. There's a cat named Cashew that maybe goes to space, or at least like someone imagines it going to space. Cashew in space.
You do find great joy in naming your characters.
Mm-hmm.
So in these two stories, everyone is nameless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What is the impetus to keep it so distant?
I think for Arena it made sense, just because like even though this is clearly a like fantastical sort of prison in a like fantastical sort of place, it's still incarceration, and it seems to me like the point of that system is to make individuals anonymous. Like you have your identity, but it's being suppressed by the system. So it made sense that no one had names in that story. With Saline, I wrote that as kind of a one-off thing. I didn't expect to write more stories about those characters. And while I clearly saw both of them as female and like have very clear pictures of who they are, in that particular story, I structured it in a way so that the reader can project whatever they want to on these people, however they want to see them. And it's a thing that I've done in the past with with a lot of stories, and I don't know if it actually works. I think the impetus was I like the impetus of like putting it on the reader to decide like who these characters are, what their race and gender and all of that. Like if it doesn't have a direct bearing on the story, then these characters can be of any race, any gender, any sexuality. But I think like it backfires because most of the time people just assume that the characters are me. So like I've created a system where you could put any sort of person into these spots, and yet like by default it's a white dude that gets put in that role. So I don't do it as much anymore. But in this instance, that was still the instance of Sailing. I still left it open.
Well, Brandon suggested a fun way to close out our evening,
Okay.
which is, do you have any recommendations from the shelves behind us of good reading material?
Yeah, lots. I just finished reading Joan Didion's Democracy, which I'd read a few times before, and that's up there. Next to the one that's pulled out. Democracy by Joan Didion is a very good book. And Already Dead by Dennis Johnson. I usually read this at least once a year. I'm planning on reading it as soon as I'm done with the next book I'm reading. It's not a very uplifting title. It's not a very uplifting book. I think it's beautiful. Dennis Johnson is one of my favorite writers, and I've learned so many very important lessons about storytelling from all of his books, but especially this one. So if you're ready for like a big, thick book with a lot of characters doing really weird stuff, Already Dead by Dennis Johnson would be my top pick for this evening.
Okay.
Is that it? I think that's it. Thank you guys for joining us for episode 4 of Quarantine Storytime. And please join us next week for episode 5 when I'll be reading. I didn't fix my script. But I will be reading from In the Mines, a book that is also a record that I created with my good friend Scott Sell, another fantastic dancey man. And while we're on the subject of being fantastic, if you are feeling too wonderful for words and would like to express your enjoyment of tonight's program by generously tipping me for my labors, or if you would like to buy a signed copy of Blue of the World or Our Shadow's Voice or any of my other books, or would like to buy a copy of Dean Thornton's We're Glad You're Here, please feel free and welcome to click the various links in the event description below. With that in mind, if you are like me and rationing out your last box of bran flakes while waiting for your government stimulus check to arrive, please enjoy the free show, keep watching, and maybe share this episode with a like-minded friend who might also enjoy stories of recovery and platonic jailhouse romance. In the meantime, stay safe out there, friends, and look out for one another. From our living room in Saco, Maine, good night. We'll see you next week.